At Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health, we strive every day to deliver results you can see in your animal's productivity and your bottom line. From a smooth transition into the milking string for your fresh cows, to a happy welcome home from your furry friend. From a strong start in your poultry flock, to consistent weight gains for your finishing hogs. We expect to earn your business and your trust with our people, our products, and our science. Our people have an intense passion for your animals and your success. You can count on us for honest, candid advice and practical solutions for your toughest challenges. As the global leader in choline production, chelation, and encapsulation technology, we take our obligation to you and to the environment seriously. Our products are backed by the most extensive and thorough research portfolio, while our business is committed to advancing environmental sustainability and animal welfare. In the end, it all comes down to results. Balchem delivers real results you can count on, results that exceed your expectations, and results that bring true value to your bottom line. Leading the charge to meet the nutritional needs of ruminants, monogastrics, and companion animals, Balchem offers a growing portfolio of nutritional products and a dedication to innovation and industry sustainability. Balchem is here to solve today and shape tomorrow. With today's low milk prices and rising feed protein costs, now is the time to turn up the dial on rumen efficiency. NitroSure precision-release nitrogen is designed to help stabilize rumen ammonia pools by synchronizing carbohydrate and nitrogen availability to the microflora. Providing a consistent supply of ammonia is proven to increase rumen microbial populations, improve fiber and dry matter digestibility, and stimulate microbial protein yield, all leading to greater efficiencies in forage utilization and higher milk and milk component production. Maximize rumen microflora with NitroSure to turn up rumen efficiency and productivity.
Hello everyone, my name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. Today's topic is Sure to Rev Your Engine. We'll be talking about the fuel each cow needs to reach maximum production levels. Today's Real Science webinar, Feeding the Metabolic Race Car, will break down how starch and fats are used within the cow to fuel growth and production. Dr. Paul Kononoff from the University of Nebraska is joining us this morning. Paul is a native of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, Canada. He holds a BSA and an MS degree in animal science from the University of Saskatchewan and a PhD in dairy nutrition from Penn State University. He has industry experience as a technical support specialist for Renaissance Nutrition and as a project manager or director of the Ruminant Feed Analysis Consortium. Paul is currently a professor of dairy nutrition and a dairy nutrition extension specialist at the University of Nebraska. Paul's research to date has focused on feed characterization and understanding the relationships between fiber quality and ruminal fermentation in lactating dairy cattle. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dairy Science and on the committee for the new Dairy NRC. Paul, you should now have control of the screen.
Good. Thank you very much, Scott. And just mention to the organizers, if for some reason there's a technical problem, feel free to message me. But I want to thank Balchem for the opportunity to bring this information to you folks. And really what my plan is today is just to talk about some generalities on energetics, and really what I want to do is walk through really some rudimentary concepts of energetics, but help us to understand how we can use some of this information that's been around for a long time, pair it with some recent science and some research observations, and most importantly, how we can use this information to feed cows better. As Scott mentioned, the title of my talk today is Feeding the Metabolic Race Car, a discussion on the use of starch and fat as fuels to support milk production. As Scott mentioned, I'm from the University of Nebraska, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at Ruminator. So actually, what I want to do is introduce you to several people here. Today's workshop, really, I have to give a lot of credit to the middle person in this picture, Dr. Logan Morris, who's in the blue shirt there. He's along two former graduate colleagues here at the University of Nebraska, Kirby Krogstad and Kyle McLean. Logan graduated about a year ago. And his dissertation was entitled Energy Metabolism in Jersey Cows, Improving Our Understanding of Energy Requirements and Utilization. The document actually is available online. If you'd like a copy of the dissertation, I've got a picture of it here. Logan liked to write. It was over 250 pages, but if you want to read it, feel free to send me a link or an email or a DM over Twitter, and I'd be happy to send it to you. So really what I want to do is start off here, some work done a long time ago. Some French scientists, Lavoisier and Laplace, in 1783, really were the first to prove that animals combust feed. And so this slide, if you go back to the metabolic race car, when we talk about combustion, this is really some major if the work came out today, you'd hear about it all over CNN and Time magazine. It'd be published in Nature. But what these French scientists observed is that heat was produced by a guinea pig, and it was equal to that amount which was that amount which the guinea pig was able to actually melt the ice when it was set in this calorimeter. They also determined that the animal and a fire produced the same amount of heat per unit of carbon dioxide produced. Later, others showed that the amount of heat produced when an animal metabolizes a substance was the same as the amount of heat when that substance was actually burned or combusted. And this really was the start of the field of energetics. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about two simple, well-known laws of thermodynamics that you probably learned in elementary school. And these are things that, these are laws that you use actually when you're trying to understand the energetics of feeding dairy cattle. So the first law of energetics is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, and all energy must be accounted for. So what I have here is a schematic diagram of the NEL system where, and again, something that you probably have all seen before in your early nutrition classes at university or college. We know that animals consume feed, and then it goes through a cascade of places where ultimately you can measure it and account for it. And really, this first law of energetics can be restated as energy input must be equal to output plus minus any change in body energy, which also has to be accounted for. And so what I have here listed is obviously gross energy, which is consumed by the animals, and these different places where it can be measured and ultimately accounted for. So we know that we lose energy through feces, and ultimately that is represented as DE, or digestible energy. Energy is also then lost as gas in urine, and then that's represented as metabolizable energy. And then ultimately, energy can go through pregnancy to tissue to milk and maintenance, all at different levels of efficiency. Heat is also produced, but at the end, what we're representing is NEL, or net energy of lactation. Okay, so the second law of energetics, which is represented here a little bit on the right-hand side of the screen, is that entropy of the universe always increases. and no transformation of energy is 100% efficient. And so inefficiencies are actually lost as heat, okay? And so what we have here is on the right-hand side is examples of energy transformations. We know that when animals consume energy, it can be transferred into muscle or fat as tissue energy. It can be used as physical activity. Body fat can transform that energy into milk fat. And ultimately, the animal does produce heat through these reactions. So let's go to dairy cows. How do we measure all of this in dairy cows? What I've got here is a figure of the system that we use at the University of Nebraska. It's a diagram of an indirect calorimeter. And we use this to study energetics. And it's really kind of one of the first stopping points of one of the places that animals lose energy that we look at. So what are these devices? It's known as a respiration chamber. So the technicians that work with this affectionately call this the phone booth, okay? And what happens is we are able to roll this over into the feed bunk, place the animal's head into the chamber, and then secure her into this chamber with the feed delivered on the bottom, and then also a source of water, which is also piped in there. And the animal stays in there for about 23 hours. During this time, what we do is we pass air through this system, and this is what's diagrammed on the right-hand side of the screen. And as we do that, what we're doing is we're measuring oxygen consumption as well as the production of CO2, okay? Ultimately, what we're assuming when we're doing indirect calorimetry is that all oxygen is used to degrade the fuel or the nutrients that are supplied in the diet, okay? If we know how much oxygen is consumed, how much CO2 and methane is produced, we're able to calculate through an old equation that was developed by Brouwer in 1965, just how much heat is produced by the animal. So as I've mentioned, that's a major source of energy loss is through heat production. Okay, so just how much of that is in Holstein and Jersey cows, this is some data that I collected a couple of years ago, actually before Logan started his studies. These are just some averages that we measure on oxygen consumption as well as CO2 and methane production in animals that we've housed here at the University of Nebraska in the system, as well as urinary nitrogen excretion and then heat production. And you can see on average, dairy cows consume about 6,000 liters of oxygen and are consuming about 500 liters of methane, producing heat which can be measured as about 29.5 mcals per day. Well, how does that compare? This is just kind of a nifty calculation that I've got on the bottom, comparing, some of the things that animals do compared to adult males and athletes. We've got the Olympics going on right now, so this may be a timely thing. But if you think about yourself, if you're a male at rest, you're consuming about 360 liters per day. Okay, obviously that's well short of what those cows are consuming. But what about an athletically trained male exercising? They're consuming about 4 liters per minute. But if you transferred that into a daily use of oxygen, believe it or not, they're consuming about what a dairy cow is doing, just going about her daily life, okay? So this is assuming that athletically trained male is training for 24 hours. What about a male marathon runner? This is an estimate of oxygen consumption, about 5.1 liters per minute. If they ran that marathon for 24 hours, they would be consuming 700 liters of oxygen. Obviously, that's not the case But really what I do is I show this to just show you, how amazing these animals are that we're working with. They're obviously combusting a lot of nutrients, and we see that through the estimated oxygen consumption and then the estimates of heat production. So I want to talk a little bit about some energy research that we've conducted at the University of Nebraska. This is a picture of the metabolism unit that we have. We've got jerseys lined up here with their feed delivered in the feed bunk. I'll show a little later, but you can see on the bottom right hand side are our indirect calorimeters. These are mobile, so when it's time to measure heat production in the animals, we'll just move these over and fit the animals in them. Obviously, with our energy research, the other thing that we're doing is we're measuring total fecal collection and urine production to measure that energy loss through excretion. And so this is a picture of the unit just on the back side of what you see here. As I mentioned, those indirect calorimeters are mobile. So what we do is we move them in front of the animal, and then the animal is then tethered inside of there, and they go about their daily business. We'll mention that it takes a little bit of training, but again, not only is the metabolism of these animals pretty amazing, but it's the behavior as well. I'm always amazed to see just how well animals adjust. We certainly do go through a training phase, but for the most part, they're really able to go through their normal lives while we do our measurements of heat production. Just some instrumentation that we have to measure heat production as well. Okay, so what is energy? Okay, this is again a slide from Logan's PhD dissertation. But really it can be defined as the ability of the feed to support work or products formed. Okay, the amount of heat, it can be measured as the amount of heat that's released when something is completely burned. So when we think about 1 pound of corn or 1 pound of fat, okay, ultimately the question is, do they yield the same amount of milk production? Well, the answer to that question is obviously no, for a couple reasons. One of them is that we know if we combust these two feeds, they result in two very different amounts of energy. Okay, and what I have listed here is the estimate of energy in 1 pound of corn. Roughly 2 megacals versus 1 pound of fat, 4.3 megacals per pound. But one of the first studies that Logan conducted here at the University of Nebraska is just a pretty simple study saying, well, okay, we know that the concentration of energy is different, but what if we actually feed different amounts, obviously, and similar amounts of energy? What actually happens to how that energy is utilized by the animals? Okay, so we know that energy is not created equal. When the animal, even though we look at that formulation sheet and say, okay, the cow is consuming this much energy, okay, we know that it gets utilized differently. In the case of starch, starch is heavily used to support microbial production, propionate production, and then ultimately glucose supply. In comparison, fat, especially in the case of a rumen inert fat or rumen protected fat, it's very energy dense, and it can be used directly to support milk fat. Okay, so as I mentioned, this first study is just going to show how manipulating energy in the diet, how does it affect metabolism? Okay, so how did we do that? This is, and this paper has been published. I've got the citation a little later, but if you can't find it, don't hesitate to reach out via email or Twitter. But very simple study in which he had formulations, and you can see these formulations listed here on the left-hand side of the screen, and then the chemical composition of these formulations on the right-hand side of the screen. And he was able to formulate these diets virtually identical in NEL, but you can see the chemical composition of these diets is very different. The high starch diet had about 30% starch, and the high fat diet had about 17% starch. In comparison, the fatty acid content of the starch diet was low, about 1.8%, and 4% on the high fat diet. Okay, so the question is, what happens in energy metabolism when you feed these two very different diets? Should mention there's some differences based in lactation, especially early lactation. You may get some insulin sensitivity, but we used the cows in late lactation. They were Jersey animals, about 1,000 pounds each. What did we observe? Okay, so this is a figure showing the amount of energy which is actually lost in the feces, in the heat, and then in the milk. Okay, and the gray bars are starch, and then the red bars are that high fat diet. Okay, one of the things that you'll see here is in that high starch diet, less energy was lost in the feces, and a little more was lost in the feces on the high fat diet. Heat production between these two animals was the same. Energy lost in the milk or produced in the milk was the same. Methane production was also very similar. Keep in mind that what we did is we manipulated rumen protected source, and so generally what it's been shown is actually as you feed more fat, if it's not protected in the rumen, you can reduce methane. Energy lost in the urine was also reduced by about 15% by feeding more starch. And then this is a really interesting observation. You can see that tissue fat, or that's energy which is retained in the tissue, significantly increased in that high starch diet. So one of the things, this is again just a figure showing tissue energy. And so in our studies, what we're able to do is estimate tissue energy by tracking where energy is going. And as I mentioned, a lot of the energy, or more of the energy, was found in the tissue on that high starch diet versus that high fat diet. Okay, with indirect calorimetry, one of the cool things we can do is look at something called the respiratory quotient. And that's a very simple ratio of CO2 to oxygen consumption. And you can derive this respiratory quotient. And generally, the oxidation of lipids will give you a respiration quotient of about 0.71, and oxidation of protein about 0.81, and then carbohydrates about 1. Okay, so actually what we observed is the respiratory quotient of greater than 1 is also known to suggest that there's lipid synthesis going on. And indeed, in our high starch diet, we did observe a higher respiratory quotient. Okay, question is, what was happening here? We didn't measure insulin or glucose in the blood, but we believe there's a strong indication that there was increased insulin from the starch, resulting in more tissue being built by those animals, especially in late lactation. Okay, so what did we observe on the energy content? And I think this is really quite interesting. What I've got listed on the right-hand side of the screen is what the NRC 2001 estimated the NEL content of the starch diet and the high-fat diet. As I mentioned, they were pretty similar. But what we observed were some pretty key differences. Okay, if we look at digestible energy, metabolizable energy, and NEL, you can see that this was actually greater in the starch diet versus the high-fat diet. And also, the NEL content was actually much higher than what the NEL predicted. And so this is really interesting when we look at it. The question is, why did that occur? Okay. One of the reasons, I think, is if you look at the efficiencies of converting DE to ME or ME to NEL, what we actually observed in our study was slightly greater than what's estimated by the NRC. And so I think there's opportunities for future research to look at the efficiencies of energy utilization and actually tie that to computer modeling or predictions. But what we observed across the board is that it was a little higher. Okay, the other one I should mention is that tissue energy, we don't actually measure tissue energy. That's the one thing we can't measure. It's really estimated by difference of all those other components. And so there could be some error in some of those measures, you know, feces, urine, heat, milk, that ultimately gets compounded in tissue energy. So some of that error could be showing up there. Okay, what about nitrogen utilization? One of the things that was interesting in this study is that we saw that urinary nitrogen on the high starch diet was about 18% less, and milk nitrogen was about 7.6% higher. Nutrient digestibility, I'll just go through this quickly. Starch digestibility was a little lower in that high starch diet, about 2.6%, probably simply because there was just so much starch and maybe saturated enzymes to reduce digestibility. We know that as you feed less of a nutrient, digestibility tends to occur. Ultimately, energy digestibility was actually higher in that high starch diet. Okay, what do we see in milk production? I hadn't mentioned this, but what we originally hypothesized is that the high fat diet would increase in efficiency of metabolizable energy to milk energy, because we also know that the incorporation of fat to milk is much more efficient than de novo lipogenesis. However, this is not what we observed, and it's possible that it may have been happening, but the effect was so small it may have been negligible. What we actually saw is that milk yield was higher for that starch diet. Okay, and then also statistically significant was an increase in milk protein yield. So then the question is, why, when we fed starch compared to fat, did we see more milk protein yield? Okay, we really think there's probably one or all three reasons that could be answering this. The first is we believe that the high starch diet may have stimulated microbial protein. Okay, and we know that if we feed that rumen, we feed the rumen microorganisms, and they will deliver protein to the small intestine and for the animals to use. The other thing is that starch may have actually spared amino acids for catabolism. So some of these amino acids can be used for energy, but if we were supplying enough energy through the starch, perhaps more of those amino acids were available for protein synthesis. Okay. The other thing is the conversion of Me to NEL was actually greater. I mean, I've mentioned the efficiency of that utilization, but it was actually greater in that high starch diet. Okay, so what are some practical implications of this study? I know in one of the loops that was played as we were waiting for this webinar, it talked a little bit about ration costs. And we know that corn is about $240 to $300 per ton. Fat is a little more expensive, $1,500 to $2,000 per ton. If we look at milk protein, $2 per pound, milk fat about $1.9 per pound. Okay, I think practically some of the suggestions that Logan concluded in this study is that you can really use diets, and I don't just say this because I'm a Cornhusker from Nebraska, but using dietary starch can really be used as a foundation to reduce costs and increase milk protein. We know that feeding too much starch can result in milk fat depression, and so obviously you can go overboard. And also, you know, if you feed a lot of starch, especially to cows in late lactation, maybe ours were borderline on that, you know, you have an inclination of increasing body weight gain and body fat. Okay, it's a good thing in some cases, but can be problematic in other cases as well. So you should be, as you're feeding starch, you know, evaluating body weight gain and of course milk fat tests. And I'd say milk fat test is something that nutritionists are very sensitive to, and this increased body weight gain is maybe a harder thing to get a handle on unless you're really walking pens on a very frequent basis and measuring body condition score methodically. The other recommendation is certainly fat has its place, and it can be used to meet energy requirements. And once the foundation is set with many of the nutrients, I believe fat certainly has its place in meeting energy requirements in animals. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is talk about how energy may interact with amino acid metabolism. There's a lot of interest in the industry right now on amino acid metabolism, understanding that, understanding formulation to increase milk protein tests. We know generally fatty acids, they supply about 4 to 10% of the digestible energy that animals consume. Fats can also be directly transferred into the milk fat. So there's a real level of efficiency there. Starch, it can supply anywhere from about 25 to 40% of the digestible energy. The interesting thing about starch is that it supplies energy in 2 locations. And we're not really sure in any situation exactly where all the energy is going. Some of that energy is used to fuel rumen production, so the production of VFAs, propionate that gets used, then supplies glucose. But some of that can be also used post-ruminally as well. And so there's always, many of our formulation models attempt to understand this, but this is something that that's a little harder for us to understand in the field. Okay, generally, as I mentioned in that first study, starch tends to support milk protein for the reasons that I've already described, and it may, especially at high concentrations, reduce milk fat. Okay, just tying back into this study, we also know that lysine is commonly thought, and I think it's pretty clear, it can be shown to be limiting in corn-based diets. So diets that have a lot of protein from corn sources could be limited in lysine. So we conducted, Logan did all of the hard work, as well as his colleagues, graduate student colleagues as well. But he designed a study that hypothesized that milk protein synthesis, as well as energy and nitrogen utilization with increased lysine supply, will depend upon energy source. And so what he did is he designed a study, and I'll be showing those treatments in a second, but he altered the source of energy and then the concentration of lysine, and through a pretty elaborate statistical design, track some of the differences that can occur. It was done again with very similar methods of studying energy metabolism that I've already mentioned. Okay, so how did he do this? The study is actually in press. It should be coming out in the next several months of the Journal of Dairy Science. It can be found obviously in his dissertation as well. But he used a fairly elaborate experimental design looking at the response surface experiment design to conduct these interactions between 3 factors. I've mentioned the 3 factors. The first was changing dietary fatty acids. One of the way he did that was actually just changing the amount of a supplemental commercial fat. The fatty acid composition of this ingredient is listed in this screen. He did that by replacing soy hulls. The other thing that he did is he took soy hulls and he changed starch from 20 to 31% of the diet dry matter by replacing soy hulls with corn grain. He also used a commercial lysine source and titrated that from 0 to about 16 grams per day. And so by changing these different concentrations, and what he did is ultimately develop a test that included 5 levels of each of the factors in what's known as a central composite design. And actually, he had 15 dietary treatments. I'm not going to go through in this study all of these dietary treatments. It would be mind-blowing and probably take us 2 days just to walk through that. I'm going to show you some big picture response patterns, because that's what this design was really, this experimental design was really set up to do, is help us understand these response patterns as fat, starch, and digestible lysine was actually changed. This is just a quick overview of the descriptive statistics in this study. Again, Jersey cows. We used 25 cows. They were actually fed 4 of those diets. So for us, measuring total fecal excretion, nitrogen excretion, and then heat production, fairly large study. A lot of work went into just collecting all of the all of the sources of energy loss. And then average dry matter intake, energy corrected milk, fat and protein is listed here. Okay, so the first thing that Logan observed is that as in this study, he increased the concentration of fatty acid from about 3 to 6%. There was a reduction in dry matter intake. The hypothesis here is that this was really a function of differences in energy density. There was no differences in total milk yield in this study. And as I mentioned, energy corrected milk was about 35 kilograms. I don't have the milk yield, but milk yield was not different in this study. So fatty acid, maybe not a big surprise. Fatty acid increasing fatty acids resulted in a reduction in dry matter intake. What about milk protein? And this is where things get maybe a little bit more complicated. We've got a figure here which lists the supplementation amounts of digestible lysine and then the concentrations of starch, and looking at milk protein. And milk protein, you may say, well, why did we look at milk protein instead of milk yield? Generally, especially when milk yield doesn't change, milk protein is perhaps by some considered maybe the most sensitive way to look at some of these changes in the diet and when we're studying the effects on milk protein. And so Logan actually observed an interaction between starch supply and supplemental lysine. And I think this is a pretty interesting response, and I think the findings really can be used in the field. But what he observed is that milk protein increased as he increased supplemental lysine in diets that were low in starch. So where is that in this rather complicated figure? If you look at this point here, this represents a low concentration of digestible lysine and a low concentration of starch. And so you can see that milk protein increased at these low concentrations of starch, okay? However, on high concentrations of starch, lysine did not increase milk protein. So what's happening there? Again, going back to some of the findings of the original study, we believe that this simply may be a difference in the animals responding to differences in the flow of microbial protein. Obviously, microbial protein is probably lowest on these high starch diets, and so less lysine is actually being produced in the rumen and flowing to the small intestine. Therefore, at really low concentrations of starch, digestible lysine had a very positive effect on milk protein. If you go into the literature, there's different studies out there that have looked at the response to feeding more lysine. And you'll see that some of these observations are mixed, and we really believe that this may be one reason why you see there's varying observations in the literature. The other thing that Logan observed is that total fatty acid, as you increase it in the diet, Fatty acid digestibility decreased. Again, I think this is fairly well known and staked out in the literature, is that at some point the digestibility of that fatty acid reaches a maximum, and then tends to decrease as you feed more of it. What did Logan see for metabolizable energy? What he actually saw was the highest metabolizable energy was observed at about 4.2, which was about 0.65 pounds of supplemental fat. Okay, so what this figure shows is that dietary ME content quadratically increased as dietary fatty acid increased to about, I think this maximum is about 5.2. This obviously was observed here. One of the reasons was because fatty acid digestibility was quite high here. But then at that point, really, even as we increased the fat content, ME did not actually increase past this concentration. Nitrogen utilization, I'm going to go through these last slides pretty quickly, but starch actually had a positive effect on milk nitrogen. I've already talked about the responses in milk protein and the value of starch there. And then actually nitrogen balance, there was this kind of U-shaped figure, and we speculate that the supply of lysine, when it was low, the mobilization of tissue was likely suppressed, and when the supply of lysine was high, there was an increased lysine pool, which may have supported actually some muscle protein as well. So these are just some general conclusions from these studies. Increasing dietary starch generally has positive effects on milk protein and body fat gain as a source of fuel for these animals, okay? Increasing dietary fatty acids and starch does increase the conversion of DE into ME. I didn't go through this in much detail, but what we speculate here essentially and what we observed is that there's less urine and less methane energy that's lost by feeding these energy sources. Additionally, increasing lysine certainly increases milk protein, and that really seemed to be evident in low starch diets, okay? The other thing that Logan observed is that lysine may be preferentially used by muscle tissue, especially when starch is high. And that's, obviously is a really a challenge when we're trying to understand amino acid metabolism, is, what is the animal doing with it? These amino acids go to more than just milk protein, but they can actually be used by the body and go to different sources there. And so sometimes that's hard to model or track. So, as I close here, there's just some general thoughts that I'd like to leave with you. As you're using your nutrition models, many of them assume a constant efficiency of converting ME into NEL or DE into ME, okay? I would just suggest that sometimes these efficiencies change, and so if what you're observing in the field is maybe different than what your software is saying, I know many people are out here are experts in maybe understanding why that could occur, but some of that could simply be because of the efficiencies are different than what's assumed by that formulation software. The other thing is, I really think, and this is something that Logan concluded in his thesis, is that understanding this efficiency of utilization, if we were more precise rather than just having one efficiency for energy corrected milk, but maybe in the future finding ways to model the efficiency of this energy for fat production, for milk protein production and lactose, maybe we could improve our understanding and predictive ability of these models as well. The other thing, which shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody, milk protein synthesis, we know that obviously amino acids are important, but energy is intimately linked to milk protein synthesis, okay? As I mentioned, starch, we don't always know exactly where all of that energy is going and in what proportions, but that energy could be used in the rumen, for rumen fermentation, or it can be directly supplied to the animal in post-absorptive metabolism. Obviously, you know, the field of amino acids and dairy cattle nutrition continues to evolve. We only manipulated lysine in our study, but other amino acids certainly should be considered in the future, and I really look forward to seeing that field develop in the near future. Just the last thing, energy from starch may enable a greater response of supplemental lysine. And so I think that's one of the neat things that we saw in Logan's work that I've outlined here. So with that, I think our organizers are still running the show. I'd be happy to answer any questions that are out there. Scott, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much, Paul. That was very interesting. Looking forward to getting you on the podcast here in a month or so. Before we get started answering questions, though, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
$0.05 might not seem like much, but when it's 5 cents for every cow every day, then it really adds up. New AminoSure XM precision-release methionine provides the optimal combination of cost, feed stability, rumen stability, and intestinal release to deliver the best cost per unit of available methionine on the market today. Learn how at balchemanh.com/findyourx.
All right. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane on the attendee control panel. So we've got a lot of questions here. Let's get started with one from Kenneth. Kenneth, he says, "Hi, Paul. What is your view on starch plus sugar in comparison to fats or fatty acids? Will sugar also play a role? And does one look at starch plus sugar or only starch in comparison to fats and amino acids?"
Yeah, that's a really good question. So many of the feed testing labs are giving estimates of sugar compared to and in addition to starch. Obviously, in our studies, we only manipulated starch, but yeah, I absolutely think starch plays a very similar role as sugar plays a similar role as starch. I think maybe that the one difference is a lot of that sugar is utilized in rumen fermentation and less is available for post-absorptive sites. So certainly I haven't outlined any nutritional requirements, but absolutely the answer to the question is yes, that supplies very valuable energy and can actually be used to replace some of the starch as well. But virtually all of that is available in the rumen. So good question. I'm glad that point was made here today.
All right, I've got a couple questions very similar here. One from James from Ohio and Adam from Michigan. I'm going to read Adam's. In the Morris study, the authors used a stearic acid-rich fat supplement that led to a lower digestible energy absorption. Do you think this is true across all types of fat supplements, or is it more specific to specific fatty acids and blends of fatty acids? You made conclusions about fat, but really this should be about the specific stearic acid enriched supplement. Any thoughts about other fatty acids and blends?
Yeah, no, No, that's a really good question. Obviously, this study was very controlled, looking at this one particular one. These different sources obviously do differ in digestibility. I would say it, unfortunately, well, our study was obviously limited to that one, but I really look forward to more research looking at different types of fatty acids and nailing down differences in digestibility with these different fatty acids. So it's a good question. I really think that we need more work in this area to understand the digestibility of these different fatty acids. And certainly, you know, doing studies like this, as well as other studies that are out there comparing different fats is certainly needed.
All right, thank you for that. The next one comes from Caroline. Are data on Jersey cows fully comparable to Holstein/Frisian cows?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad that was brought up. Maybe, Scott, let me take a step back, and the audience may be wondering why we're using jerseys. First, I'll say I love all dairy breeds, but I'm particularly fond of the Jersey breed. That's not why we do it. The main reason why we're using jerseys is I showed you in those pictures, we're measuring total fecal excretion, urine excretion, and then heat production. So those are, unfortunately, there's no simple way to do that. Some people use markers. Personally, I'm always a little wary of the accuracy of these markers. But what we're doing is we're collecting all of these feces and urine. And so the jerseys are a little smaller. Our metabolism facility here is in Lincoln, which is a city of about 250,000. They just fit better in the system. The other thing is, you're talking about a metabolic race car. You know, those Jersey or those Holstein animals they consume a lot more oxygen, and those head boxes, like, just mechanically really have to work hard in Jerseys because their metabolism, just their total energy consumption and metabolism is lower. Things run a little better, a little more efficient. So that's the difference between kind of a Hummer and maybe a Yugo. But so that's why we're using jerseys. The question is, you know, how are they different than Holsteins? I will say most of our studies are with jerseys, but we do have some with Holsteins. We're always amazed at how similar when you actually take all of these energy measurements and express things per unit of metabolic body weight, just how similar these breeds are. And I attribute that to the great work of the geneticists moving both breeds forward. And so when we've looked at our metabolism studies and the data using Jerseys versus Holsteins, they're very similar. I'm very confident to say that any of the energetics that we're measuring in Jerseys, when we express it per unit of metabolic body weight, it can be transposed to Holstein. So I'm glad the question was raised, and I believe that things are very applicable to the Holstein breed.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Michael from New Zealand. Your first study presented found ME was lower for high-fat treatment, but the second study found ME increased with increasing fat. What is driving the opposing response, and what is the take-home message for ration balancing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Take-home message is I guess I think one of the reasons I'd maybe talk about the discrepancy there. One of the reasons could be stage of lactation. Remember, the first study had cows in later lactation that were probably very responsive to utilizing the energy there. So I think perhaps stage of lactation has an effect on maybe some of the differences that we observed in between these two studies, especially if you look at the source of energy. As far as the take home, I'd maybe go back to some of the conclusions for that first study. Obviously, and again, I don't say this just because I'm a corn husker, but using corn, is a very economical source of energy. And then again, just applied recommendations is to top off and ensure that you're supplying enough energy, or the energy that you think you need, the animals need, through some of these fat source, commercial available fat sources. So really, we can't put one against the other, but being able to utilize both in a logical fashion, I think is the recommendations I'd make.
All right, thanks, Paul. Our next question comes from Chan He. It looks that increasing lysine at high starch decreased milk protein percent. How do you explain it?
Scott, can you repeat the question just to make sure I get that?
Yeah, it said it looked like increasing lysine at the high starch levels decreased milk protein percent.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if I have an answer. If you recall, increasing lysine at low starch increased milk protein. And so for us, we've been able to say that's probably because of more microbial protein. Some of the, lack of response, or maybe a slightly negative response for milk protein at the high starch diet, we really don't have a good understanding of why we observed that. So that's a keen observation, and I'm still kind of stuck and looking for suggestions there. So good question.
Our next one comes from Muhammad. Would you think fat levels in the experimental diets might have inhibited microbial fermentation in using diets with a lower difference between dietary fat yield, different results in comparison to starch?
Yeah. So the question is, did we inhibit microbial fermentation by feeding so much fat? What I would, well, the study will be coming out, and don't hesitate to reach out if you want the dissertation. But think when we look at got the diets here, the baseline fatty acid content of all of our diets was quite low. And when we manipulated fat, that was only done by increasing a rumen inert source. So we don't really think that we had negative effects on rumen fermentation from the fat. But certainly when we design these studies, it's really important to understand where you start and then adding from there. And so we really made attempts for our baseline diet to be low in fat.
All right. Our next question comes from Italy. Stefano would like to know, in Northern Europe, it's quite common to feed diets low in starch, high in grass silage. Based on the evidence of your team's studies, would you suggest to feed protected lysine in these diets? And would high NDF digestibility in some way balance for the loss in protein yield due to low starch supplementation?
Scott, can you read that question again? Sounds like a great question.
A long one.
I look forward to thinking through it.
Yep. So in Northern Europe, it's quite common to feed diets low in starch because they're high grass diets. Based on the evidence your team studied, would you suggest to feed protected lysine in these diets? So that's one question. And then would high NDF digestibility in some way balance for the loss in protein yield due to low starch supplementation? So it's actually two questions in one.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, we really maybe have to take a step back and ask ourselves what's happening in the rumen. I think that maybe could help us answer kind of both of those questions. But, as we feed these animals, just understanding what we're doing with microbial protein yield. And if there are cases where microbial protein yield is lower than we'd like it to be, these animals could maybe have some responses by feeding rumen-protected lysine. But yeah, you're right. In a diet that maybe contains a lot of grass and not a lot of starch, there may be some opportunities for lysine there. But I'd really maybe encourage the person that's asking the question just to ask themselves, what's happening with microbial protein, and then use that as a guide for understanding whether lysine could be required or the animals could see a response or not.
All right, thank you. Next question comes from Ronnie. What is your thoughts about the high NEL in the diets that is predicted by the NRC? Is that a breed effect, or can be the genetics of the animals that had improved over time, especially energy utilization?
Yeah.
Does the nutritionist should take the NEL difference into account?
Yeah, I love that question. So in that first study, we saw NEL was actually higher than what the NRC predicted. So are cows better, more energy efficient than they used to be? Could that be one reason? And surprisingly, I haven't shared it here, but Logan has another study where he looked at energy utilization in animals, and he broke things apart. He actually measured maintenance, and then he measured efficiency of utilization of ME to NEL. And so when we talk about energy metabolism, a lot of energy is used for maintenance, and people commonly think that animals are bigger, animals have greater maintenance, and so there's kind of a loss of energy that's happening there. And so what Logan actually observed is that that is indeed the case, that maintenance is a little higher than what the NRC predicted. So that doesn't answer the question. The question is, why is it higher? But when he actually observed the efficiency of utilization, or KL, so energy from ME to milk energy, he indeed did see greater efficiency of utilization in our study compared to what's assumed in the NRC. So the answer to the question is, yeah, we do see probably improved genetics have improved efficiency of utilization, or this KL, but maintenance has also increased. And so actually the difference isn't really there. Maintenance increases, KL improves, and so there's really no difference in the net on that NEL system. And so no, we certainly, although genetics has an effect, some of that in that NRC system is offset by increased maintenance as well.
So speaking of the NRC, and you are on the committee, Marcos would like to know, will the new NRC report starches and sugar fractions?
So I love the question, something obviously near and dear to my heart. I think everybody knows ADSA will be sponsoring a Discover conference outlining the NRC requirements and the new publication that's pending, that's coming up later this month. So a lot of this information is yet to come. Unfortunately, I'm in a position where I'm unable to speak on that report until it's been published. But I would just maybe note, obviously, the committee itself, really our biggest charge is to translate information that's been published in the peer review literature and incorporate it into the report. And so, as you evaluate the report and wondering, okay, is this here or why isn't it here? Take a step back and say, well, where is that publication base to evaluate this? So that will all be shared for the first time at the Discover conference, and then obviously the publication. So Scott, I know it's maybe not the answer this individual was looking for, but I'm not at liberty yet to say and answer that question.
Totally understand, Paul, and appreciate you saying that it'll be shared at the Discover Conference. I'd like to add that following the Discover Conference, the very next week, we will have 5 Real Science lecture series based on the new NRC to help introduce that to the public. So there will be 2 on 1 week and 3 the following week with 3 different sections. And so I see Kim is putting that on the screen there. So we're getting up to the top of the hour. Let's end with just a couple quick questions here. Brian would like to know, how would feeding sugar alter energy conversion?
Mm-hmm. I think for the most part, so there's obviously there's some energy that's needed to break down the starch molecule, but I would say, you know, for the most part, many of the observations that you see for starch are very similar as you would see for sugar as well.
And then our last question, when feeding high starch diets, are there any other nutritional strategies that can be employed to get cows to convert more of the energy from starch into milk as opposed to increasing adipose tissue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, you know, there's different processing technologies that can influence where energy is actually digested, but that question is maybe beyond the scope and maybe enters into a lot of hypothesis and speculation. So nothing, you know, really applied comes to mind in answering that question.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The next Real Science Lecture Series webinar will be our monogastric audience on August 10th, when Dr. Jenna Wilson from the University of Georgia will discuss what's new in broiler breeder management. We're very excited for our September webinar series titled Unveiling the 2021 Dairy NRC. This series will consist of 5 webinars featuring a review of specific segments of the new NRC. The series will kick off on September 8th and 9th, and then continue with webinars on September 14th, 15th, and 16th. Each will take place at our regular time of 10 a.m. Eastern Time here in the United States, and will also be available in Spanish. You can register for these, the entire series, with one click. Visit balchem.com/realscience for more details and to register. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. We now have 20 episodes out on YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, and also at balchemanh.com/podcast. We go behind the scenes to hear the conversations that take place over a few drinks with friends. Search for Real Science Exchange on your favorite podcast platform and be sure to follow us. And don't forget to request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt. Learn how at balchemanh.com/podcast. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Kononoff, thank you for joining us today.